Hello, I hope you're all having a great week this week and enjoying the fabulous weather we've been having. What I wanted to do in this short video is just go over assignment 2 and respond to some questions that people usually have and give you a little overview. If you've already done this assignment, this would be a good chance just to review it and take a look at what you've done. If you're in the middle of working on it, which I hope you are, this is just a way to maybe help you get organized. So I'll hit each section and briefly talk about what I'm looking for in each section. It might be helpful at this point, if you don't have it, to print out a copy of the outline so that you can take notes directly onto the sheet. The first section, a brief rationale or a need for a plan, you can get this from the descriptive information. Just as a warning, there's a lot of information in that case study that you don't necessarily need, so you don't feel that you've got to use every single thing in there. What I'm looking for is a very short paragraph that describes this student and how he's functioning, and says a little bit about the setting. So think of a short paragraph. If you've read it and you've jotted down a few notes, you could probably just write a short paragraph and it would be fine. The next section, rationale or need for a plan, I always include in an intervention plan why the plan is needed. I believe that it's important to get input from people as to why we need an intervention, and you state that right up front. It's communicating to people who are going to be carrying this out every day why it's important. So what are the behaviors that are limiting this person, and what's the goal of this plan? Is the goal to help this student function better in this setting, or is it to increase the student's options and placement possibilities? Is it to give this person more employment options? I just say that right up front. Here we talk about the problem behaviors. You've got several strategies. You have an interview and you have some observational data. As I mentioned in class, you only have to be concerned about the ABC data. There's other data there that is useful, but we've not spent a lot of time talking about it in this course. If you want to look at it, it's not difficult to figure out how to use those data collection systems, but I'm only asking you to include the ABC data. So talk about the data collection that's used. So it would be the ABC data that you're concerned with, the functional assessment interview. There's also some record review information. It's important to read that. So here you would just describe how functional behavior assessment data was collected. Mention that file reviews were done. Then I want you to list specific behaviors and talk about each one. You have some definitions in there. It's okay if you want to elaborate on those or change them a little bit, but the purpose here is just to get you used to defining behaviors in observable and measurable terms. For this section, results of functional assessment interview, I want you to focus only on the interview. Say a little bit about who the interview was done with, or with whom the interview was done. Doesn't sound right, even though it's grammatically correct. Who was the informant? And then, based on the interview information, develop an initial summary statement. This is a hypothesis that's just developed on the interview data. The reason I'm asking you to do this is when you do a functional behavior assessment, the first step is to get good indirect measures. Things like rating scale data, record reviews, and an interview, and develop an initial hypothesis. This initial hypothesis guides your data collection for the direct functional behavior assessment methods. So, based on the interview, how many functions do you believe these behaviors have? If you think there are 2 different functions, write 2 summary statements. If you're not sure about a summary statement, go back and review the PowerPoint on functional behavior assessment. Look at the examples of a summary statement. A summary statement includes only the antecedent, the specific behaviors, and the function. The number of behaviors is determined by how many behaviors serve a particular function. The number of summary statements is based on how many functions you've identified. Do not write a summary statement with more than one function in it. Even if it's the same behavior and there are two functions, you would write two summary statements. Again, if this is confusing, go back and review what goes into a summary statement. But for this section, you develop a summary statement that's just based on the interview data, because in real life, that would be all you would have at this point. In this section, collect observational data, obviously you would go out and collect data, but since this is a case study, look at the data you've already got. And in this case, it's just the ABC data. I would like you to write a brief summary of what these data say. And it can be pretty short. Be succinct. You don't have to be really wordy. Also, I'm not looking for exact numbers here. If you're close, that's good enough. So don't be concerned about nitpicking whether this particular observation is this antecedent or that antecedent. If you're describing something that's reasonably close to what those data say, it's fine. So first of all, we're going to look at big global things. How many times did each of these behaviors occur that you've identified? How many times did they occur per day? So you may want to take and look at it by day. Now I want you to just look at the antecedents. For each behavior, what are the conditions under which they occur? Here, don't list out every antecedent, but look for patterns. Do you see bigger patterns here? That's what we're looking at. For example, social situations versus demand situations. Proximity of peers versus no peers present. Do you see some commonalities among the antecedents? So the question is, what patterns do you see in antecedents for the challenging behaviors? There may be, if you have two summary statements, you would have, well, this group of behaviors seems to happen in this situation. This other group of behaviors seems to happen in this other situation. Next question, what usually happens after behaviors occur? So what are the consequences of these behaviors? When they happen, what usually happens? And it doesn't, again, we're not talking about looking and listing each specific instance. What global patterns do you see? And then finally, what appears to be the function of the challenging behaviors? To look at function, you have to consider antecedents and consequences, and it has to make sense. For example, if you're going to make the statement that this behavior appears to serve the function of escape from demands, but the antecedent is that this behavior usually happens during unstructured times or transition times, that doesn't make any sense. So you look for antecedents and consequences that tell a story about the function or reason a behavior occurs. If you have a behavior that usually happens when a student is having periods of low attention, and the behavior usually results in the student getting some kind of attention, that's suggesting that the function may be in order to obtain attention. So remember that you may have more than one function, you may not. At this point, take the information you got from your data, go back and look at the summary statement you wrote after you looked at the interview. It may be that you don't want to change it. It may be that the data supported what you said initially. If that's the case, just simply say, the data supports my initial summary statement, and then just rewrite it or paste it in. However, usually you change it a little bit. Maybe the function doesn't change, but maybe you've identified some other antecedents you want to add. Or maybe you had one summary statement initially, now you may have two. Sometimes I'll start out with two, and then when I collect data, I realize there's only one function. So I'll change it to only one summary statement. So fix your summary statement, revise it based on your data, or if you don't change it, just say the data supports my summary statement. Now, since you've got your revised summary statement, or you've supported your initial summary statement, take the competing behavior diagram. You can find it in the Functional Assessment Tools folder. If you're, still unsure about this, go back and look at the material on teaching alternative behaviors again. Draw the competing behavior diagram to fit your summary statement. The first step here is to write out the summary statement. What are the behaviors in the middle? Then what are the antecedents under which these behaviors occur? And what are the consequences, or what's the function of the behavior? Sometimes you have a setting event, sometimes you don't. If your data doesn't specifically say that you've got a setting event, leave that blank. The next thing you do when you're branching out on the competing behavior diagram is you fill in the desired behavior. What's the antecedent for the challenging behavior, and what is it you really want the student to be doing in that situation? That is the desired behavior. Then you look at the consequences that are maintaining the desired behavior. Since this is a case study, you may not know exactly, so just what's your best hunch here? Don't worry about that too much. Then we come down to the alternative behavior that is below the problem behavior, and the arrow points up towards the function of the problem behavior. Here, think about a new behavior that you could teach the student that would serve the same purpose or function as the challenging behavior. Here, it might just be an idea. That's okay. So fill in that chart so that it best fits this new summary statement. In this section, I would like you to think about antecedent strategies that you might use with this student. You don't have to write out a long description of them, just simply listing them and maybe a sentence explaining exactly what you mean would be useful. But consider these different things. First of all, what could you do? Now look at the antecedent on your competing behavior diagram very carefully. What are the things you could do to minimize the likelihood that a problem behavior might occur? Are there any curricular or instructional things that you could do differently or introduce to this student? Are there modifications you might make? Are there alternative ways of responding in instructional situations? Could you change the classroom environment in some way? Could you move the student to a different location? Could you provide a different place to do some kinds of work? Think of any kind of physical changes you might make. And then finally, how could the teachers or staff interact differently with this student? Could you give directions differently? Could you give pre-correction or warnings? So things like a visual schedule, visual demands, using behavioral momentum. If you're a little unclear here, go back and look at the Scott chapter on antecedent interventions. He lists some great ones there, and then look at the PowerPoint as well. You don't feel that you've got to provide something for each of this A, B, C, and D. It may be that your focus is on a couple of those. That's okay. What I'm looking for, are you picking things that make sense given the assessment data? It's possible that you may not come up with anything that I came up with. It doesn't mean yours is any less right. So don't think there's a one right answer or two right answers. Again, if you're picking something that's reasonable and it looks like you're basing it on the assessment information, that's fine. Now you've listed an alternative behavior on the diagram, but I would like you to expand it a little more here. List the behavior and talk a little bit about how you would teach this to the student. For example, you might have specific times that you would use modeling and role play and practice, but also how would you prompt the student to use this new skill? What are the situations in which you would do that? And how could you best teach this new skill to the student so that he is going to start using this new skill instead of the problem behavior? So give this a little bit of thought. It doesn't have to be long. Again, I think you can do this in a brief paragraph.